Everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the first webinars of the series of webinars we're going to have this week. Bonjour à tous et toutes. Merci de participer au webinaire aujourd'hui. My name is Carole Vincent. I am the Executive Director of the Centre interuniversitaire québécois de statistiques sociales, so the Quebec network of research data centers within the Canadian network. I'm told that there's almost 200 participants here today, so that's great. Like I said, today is the first of a series of webinars that will address each of the four areas of research for CRDCN. Notez pour les francophones que ce webinaire se déroule en anglais, mais qu'il y a un résumé bilingue qui sera disponible dans les semaines à venir. I want to acknowledge the ongoing support of university partners, Statistics Canada, CFI, SSHRC, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, as well as les Fonds de recherche du Québec and other provincial government and private sector partners. So it's now my pleasure to welcome our four panelists for today, Kevin Milligan, Louis Morel, Andrew Heist, and Michael Kuterud. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes about how the COVID-19 pandemic informs research questions to be asked. So what we ask them is to look at, to help identify emerging research questions and corresponding data needs, and also inform policymaking in the immediate and mid-term. So the way it works, panelists will have after each panelist speak for 5 minutes, then they will respond to questions submitted at the time of registration or today. We have quite a bit of questions in advance and really good questions, so that's great. But please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box en anglais ou en français, comme vous le souhaitez. Before we start, also, I just want to say that if you have any technical difficulties, please connect with our Zoom master. And should our broadcast be interrupted for any reason, we will move to the webinar option listed in the email that the email reminder that you have received. So I'm now turning to the panelists. I'm turning to Kevin Milligan, Professor of Economics at UBC. Kevin, you have about 5 minutes to make your opening remarks. I will give a warning at about 5 minutes, 30 seconds. So please, Kevin.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who has logged in for this, and thanks to the organizers for putting it together. I'm going to divide my comments into two pieces. One is on data and research and how it might inform short-run emergency decisions, and second is in long-run research questions. So in the short run, emergency policymaking, this isn't something where like they commission a bunch of research reports and then 12 months later you get something back. It's more like they have a question and 12 hours later they're making a decision. So it's not really an environment where research is done. This is what we're relying heavily on existing research. So, today I heard the Prime Minister talk about making a commitment towards sick leave. When looking at that, I'm sure there were some people who did a scan of research and evidence on sick leave and trying to put together what we might know about putting together that package. This isn't, as we go forward in the long run research questions, there are many things that might arise, but in terms of informing policymaking in the short run, it's not really a research intensive exercise in terms of doing research to answer questions as they make policy in the space of days. Okay, so in terms of the short-run emergency, what are the, I'm going to say data needs more than research needs. For my own purposes and my own interests and the advice I've been trying to give governments at every level on this stuff, I need real-time labor market data. We have the LFS. It has a great depth of information, and it's fantastic for what it does and what it's designed to do. but you know, the May LFS was in the field not last week, but the week before. It's going to miss. You know, I got my hair cut last week. The barbers are open, the shops are open in BC, much more so than they were 2 weeks ago. It's going to miss all that. So I guess that's going to be picked up in the June LFS, and then I guess I'm going to see that the first week of July. But that's like 6 weeks from now, and in those 6 weeks, there's going to be serious decisions made about what to happen with the CERB, what to happen with the Qs, and if we're supposed to do that in the absence of the LFS, then we have to do it with other data. So what other data could we use? Well, we have administrative data. No, someone has administrative data on CERB and Qs. Now, there is a portal with CERB data. It has the universe of people who ever have applied to CERB. We do not have current uptake of CERB. We do not have that broken down in terms of time series. We do not have that broken down in terms of province, gender, or age. This is, in my view, ridiculous. This is data that are available. This is administrative data. This is not something we have to go and do a big survey. This is putting a bit of time into making administrative data available. This isn't for researchers to go and write papers on. This is for making real-time decisions. If you're trying to talk to transit authority, if you're trying to talk to provincial government, you know, we don't know what the state of the labor market is. I mean, we have something like 7 million people on CERB. How many of those will be working in July? How many of those will be working in September? I have guesses. Other people have guesses. I'd like to do more than guess. The administrative data are available. I want to see them. I don't want to see them myself personally. I want to see them on a website so we can all see them. Okay, so that's administrative data is my number one thing there. In terms of the existing surveys, the LFS, like I said, there's, you know, it's fantastic for what it does. I don't know that you can really change what it does in terms of its timing or other things right now. But I did note on the May LFS, there were some extra questions, maybe even on the April one, about home, work from home and some other things. I think that's fantastic to add some extra questions onto existing surveys that are already planned and going out in the field. That's a great idea. Okay, so that's short run emergency stuff. Just number one thing is emergency measures, and we need to have that administrative data available. Okay, in the long run, lots of research questions that arise. I mentioned, you know, sick leave as one thing, just getting a better idea of what sick leave has been available in the past at the, you know, provided in some, you know, union contracts, and some other employers provide sick leave coverage, what that looks like. I have not looked at this myself, but I'm sure some data exists. And I think as we go forward, whatever emergency measures are put in place, those will likely be of a temporary nature, or at least as we'll have a chance to revise those in the years going forward. So understanding the effects of sick leave are an important thing. In general, other research questions that seem interesting to me, you know, the long run scarring effect of everything, of all of this on education, on workplace, on families. This is a big event, and knowing more about the long run scarring effect of these things seems useful. Another question I find quite interesting about
Kevin,
this is compensating wage differentials. I think I'm almost out of time, so I'll stop shortly. Looking at different riskiness of different kinds of work, that has changed drastically over the past few months. So understanding how compensating wage differentials work would be an important question. So I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Our next panelist is Louis Morel. Il est directeur général à la direction de la politique économique à Emploi et Développement social Canada. Alors Louis, la parole est à vous.
Merci, Carole. So thank you. So are you seeing my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I have a few remarks today. The first thing that I'd like to say is that, you know, I'm really here to try to highlight some of the research questions that are top of mind in the context of policymakers. And so let's dive right in. I have three sections. The first one is really, as we were, and we're still, I guess, in somewhat of a lockdown phase, some of the things we're interested at this stage is really who's been impacted and what's been the impact on workers by gender, sectors, region, age, family situation, class of workers, etc. But also how have they been impacted? So in terms of employment, hours worked, income, the use of different benefits, working arrangements, and so forth. And ultimately, we're trying to look at it through the lens of there's different factors that drive what some of the impact would be on workers. The fact that some jobs work with a high degree of social proximity, like the haircut that Kevin just mentioned, the ability to telework, job security and benefits. Not everyone have sickness benefits, like it was mentioned. Also, some essential workers have some specific characteristics. So understanding a bit their characteristics is interesting from a research point of view. And ultimately, also some people that continue to work during this crisis. So how they adapt to change through telework. Some may have taken some temporary arrangements in terms of getting some supplementary income, changing their hours work, starting some gig work, or like myself, trying to have some flexible hours so I can also take care of kids during the day. And obviously, we've put in place a lot of programs to help Canadian weather through the crisis. So it will be interesting as data becomes available to understand how these have been effective or not in the pandemic. So now we're moving to a phase of business resumption. Some provinces are going faster than others. So the question is really how it's going to happen. What are the necessary economic and social conditions to ensure the success? So for instance, we think a lot about childcare and obviously health and safety. That's more a topic of a further webinar or discussion. And obviously whether there's a need for fiscal stimulus. And the idea that, some workers were laid off, are they coming to the same job? Or are they finding a new one? Who's going to be laid off temporarily or permanently displaced? And obviously, as business resumes with social distancing and all of it, think about a restaurant. Is it going to happen on the intensive margins, so hours, or extensive margins via rehiring some of these people? In terms of continuing to support workers during the resumption, well, clearly the priority is on ensuring some safe workplaces from a federal government standpoint. And we're really trying to understand who will be or who is eligible to some of the existing programs like employment insurance and what's going to happen in the next few months with this. And we're quite open at this stage. So when some of the benefits were put in place, as Kevin mentioned, you had a question, 12 hours later, you had to have an answer, the things were implemented. So this was an emergency situation. So now that we move into less of an emergency situation, if there are more waves of infection, how should we put the design of those programs? And basically, just generally, what policies can help the labor market adjust? The last thing I want to say is more about think about the post-COVID world. There's going to be some long-term impacts on workers. So we hope there's not going to be many long-term unemployed, but if there are there some opportunities for them to upskill and reskill to get new employment opportunities? And just more generally, in the research literature, what are some of the policies to address long-term unemployment? In terms of students, are we going to see a cohort effect? We know that graduates that graduate in a recession have a longer harder time to find jobs. So this is an issue. And clearly on the social side, anything has to do with income inequality, poverty rates, homelessness, is it going to have some long-term impact on those? So moving to the last section I want to talk about is changing the structure of the labor market and the economy. So we are working towards a future of work. Things are changing, automation, artificial intelligence, digital skills. Robots don't ever get sick from COVID. So maybe there will be an increased demand for automation. What does it mean for workers? And in terms of, therefore, how do we need to prepare our workers in terms of having new skills? How do we develop those skills? And what about teleworking? We were probably all home at this stage. And, what's the evidence from the literature in terms of, is it productivity enhancing? Is it not? We all have our own personal experience in the pandemic. And then, a few months ago, we were talking about labor shortages a lot. And, there's a population aging. Those trends should reassert themselves. So, how does it fit in the bigger picture? And from a government delivery perspective, there's a need for more online access to services. So these are kind of the questions that we have on our mind, and we welcome the research community's input on all of these questions and many more. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Louis. Our next speaker is Andrew Heights. He's director at the Center for Income and Socioeconomic Wellbeing Statistics at Statistics Canada. Andrew, you have your 5 to 6 minutes.
Thanks, Carol. And thanks everyone for participating in the webinar today. I'm going to assume that Kevin, Louis, and Mikhail are going to focus more on the profound labor market impacts of the COVID pandemic and the associated economic shutdown. And the key questions there are clear. What's going to happen to job security? Will we see a rise in the gig economy? Will people return to their existing jobs? And what will happen to the 1/3 of the unemployed persons who in April had no connection to existing or recent jobs? What role will working at home play in the recovery, and does this signal a shift in our way of working in that respect? And what about the pace of recovery? Are we going to get a fast recovery, a slow recovery, lingering recession? The monthly labor force survey and other survey and administrative data on the labor market will certainly be mined in the coming weeks and months to uncover the labor market story of this pandemic-driven recession. For my part, I'm going to take a few minutes to share a few thoughts about the impact the pandemic may have on inequality and poverty. Family after-tax disposable income inequality has been mostly steady over the last 20 years. However, persistent inequalities still prevail. Recent immigrants, Indigenous people, single seniors, persons in lone parent families, and young singles in their 20s are examples of groups with higher poverty rates than others. In the last few years, we've seen improvements in poverty rates for families with children, associated with improved labor market positions of parents and increased income received through the Canada Child Benefit. But poverty numbers have remained largely steady for singles and for seniors. So what will be the impact of COVID-19 on inequality and poverty? Well, we've seen already that a lot of employment declines early in the shutdown were concentrated among persons with lower pay. Women and visible minorities seem to bear a disproportionate share of unemployment in March, and job losses were concentrated among service sector industries where return to work could be a challenge due to physical distancing guidelines. How these factors impact the income of families remains to be seen. Impacts to parents' market incomes place at risk those improvements in poverty that I mentioned a moment ago. But the trends could play out differently depending on how individuals return to work, how government transfers offset wage losses, and how individual circumstances play out at the family level. We know from previous recessions in the 1980s and 1990s, these were accompanied by large increases in market income inequality, essentially a ratcheting up of market income inequality. And these changes became essentially permanent fixtures of the income distribution, with successively higher levels of market income inequality at the family level in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s after each recession. So a question that comes to my mind is, well, what will the impact of the current slowdown be? Will we see another ratcheting up in market income inequality? And will we start to basically have to begin to live with a higher level of inequality, or will some different kind of trend happen? And will this level of market income inequality simply flow through to a higher level of after-tax income inequality, or will something else happen, such as government transfers or some other mitigation happen to reduce the level of after-tax income inequality? Taking a step further, contemporary thinking sees poverty as being multifaceted. It can be seen in housing, neighborhoods, educational outcomes, health outcomes, etc. So my second point is that I'll be really interested to see if poverty and inequality is manifested in other ways beyond monetary poverty. What will be the trends in well-being? Looking beyond GDP has taught us of the importance of looking beyond the aggregates and beyond looking simply at money metrics towards a more holistic view of well-being. At Statistics Canada, we host Employment and Social Development Canada's Dimensions of Poverty Hub, which tracks developments in a suite of poverty indicators, including core housing need, unmet healthcare needs, food insecurity, and asset poverty. And a question to ask members of the CRDCN network is, are there other indicators that would be interesting to track in light of the pandemic? Are there other things that we could be picking up and monitoring in these dashboards that would provide a more wholesome or a fuller view of poverty? Finally, over the last 2 years, I've been responsible for leading in partnership with the SDC, the government's review and redesign of Canada's official poverty line, the market basket measure. The revised poverty measure, this culminated in a release of a revised market basket measure in February of this year, shortly before the pandemic struck. This revised poverty measure includes updating housing costs, it rethinks transportation costs, and it's built on Health Canada's new nutritional guidelines. And in many ways, so this revised poverty measure will be more appropriate for tracking poverty going into and coming out of the COVID crisis. So if I may, end my presentation with a request. StatCan is presently working with government officials, academics, and the general public to review this revised measure of poverty, which will be adopted in the coming months. And I would invite interested researchers in the CRDCN to review our discussion papers on the updated MBM and provide us with feedback on how we should be best measuring poverty. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Now I'd like to invite Michael Scudero. He is Professor of Economics at University of Waterloo. Michael, over to you.
Myself here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. I'm just going to give you kind of a picture of how I see the situation, and maybe that will help to generate some research ideas. The way I see the situation is that, in my guess, we've lost about 3 to 5 million jobs. At least there's been furloughs of 3 to 5 million jobs. When I teach labor markets to my students, I often use an analogy of musical chairs. When I was told to go home and start teaching from home in mid-March by the university, I thought this was sort of a temporary thing. It was kind of like in a game of musical chairs that they turned the music off, and I would go home and do my teaching at home for a few weeks, and then at some point the government or the university would tell me to go back, and I would just go back to the job or the chair that I used to have. I think we're realizing increasingly that's not what's happening here. I think I was probably very naive that thinking we would all just sort of go back to where we were. This is going to have some much longer run impacts than I realized at that time. And as days go by, I'm realizing this more and more. There was a University of Chicago study published a couple of weeks ago that was very thoughtful and came to the conclusion that 42% of all the layoffs and furloughs that we've seen to this point in the US are going to be permanent. Okay, so why does that happen? Why would these jobs be permanent layoffs? I think we have to think about the two sides of the labor market to understand that. On the demand side, what's happened is people have been told to go home and sectors have been hit really hard. Tourism, retail, restaurants, all these kinds of businesses have been hit hard, and some of these businesses were having difficulty, were marginal businesses with marginal profits before this was hit. And so we're going to lose a lot of businesses. In addition, a lot of firms are going to decide about changes in how they're going to do things, how much labor they need. I have a friend who works in the robotics industry who's saying that there's just booming demand. So there's going to be changes internally within firms in the kinds of inputs they use and how much labor they use. Firms are going to realize, well, we can maybe do more than we thought we could with fewer workers. So that's going to affect things. But there's other sectors that are going to be booming as a result. Healthcare, ICT, Zoom is booming as a result of this. The agricultural industry can't find enough temporary foreign workers because those inflows have been shut down. So there's going to be reallocation of workers. There's going to be a lot of job reallocation. And I think we need to start thinking about this ahead of time. What happens when there's job reallocation? Some workers respond very well. Workers that have mobile skills that can go across sectors. If you have good computing skills, you know how to run servers, you can easily transition from a sector that was hit to one that's growing. But other workers can't. And so we've got to start thinking as early as this is about training, about education, about how we help and support workers make those reallocations. The job vacancy data is going to be critical. Don Drummond played a really important role in trying to get better job vacancy data in Canada. We now have a survey. There's too much of a lag. We need those data now. We need them as soon as possible. Those are going to be critical, even more than the labor force survey going forward. We need to know what the vacancies are, we need to know the durations of those vacancies, and we need to know what the wages are that are being offered to see where there are genuine shortages. Okay, so that's the one side of the market. The chairs are going to be changing. How many chairs are available for the players in the musical chairs game is going to change. But it's also there are constraints, really important constraints on the supply side that are going to affect the amount of, to the extent that we're not going to go back to where we were. So there's virus fears, and that's where I was naive. The virus fears are not going to disappear anytime soon. This is very personal for me. I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma 2 years ago and had a very intensive chemotherapy regimen. I've been told by my oncologist, you are not going back to work. I will be here sitting in this office a year from now. I am not alone. I'm very lucky. I have a salary job and I can work from home. There are a lot of people in my situation that can't go back to work who need support, and trying to figure out who needs the support is going to be critical. I mean, I feel very passionate about this. I think this is a really important time for research. The CURB work incentive effects is something we all kind of, because we're sitting in these kind of luxury jobs and we're afraid to talk about the effects of work incentives and how they're affected by CURB entitlements. My colleague Stephanie Louise had a paper that was nominated for, or won the runner-up prize in the Vanderkamp prize, was announced yesterday. We know that EI entitlement durations and generosity affects job search intensity. I think we can't close our eyes. We have to look at these effects. We can't ignore it. We're hearing about it in the agricultural sector already. And then finally, and I think maybe most importantly, is that within families, Andrew talked about this, we need to see inside families. We need to see those intra-household decisions. How are they adjusting? And we don't have good enough information. The labor force survey got rid of all the spousal information in the public use files. It's gone. We don't have any information on that. We need to know how these decisions are being made. And the fact is, there's overwhelming evidence that this is not equal, and the constraints that are faced by people is very unequal along gender lines within families. And also because women are more likely to be single parents. So we really need to support people that are able to go to work. I mean, it's highly inefficient if people are facing these caregiving constraints at home, okay? And those responsibilities overwhelmingly fall on women, no question. So, I don't know how much more time I have, but I just want to emphasize, I've been sitting at home here. I literally almost have not gone out. I haven't been to a grocery store of any kind, and I'm going to be here for a year. I have never felt such a sense of community in my research community. I genuinely haven't. I've gotten involved in Twitter, which I never had before, but I really am feeling enthusiastic about collaboration, about interdisciplinarity. I think this is an opportunity. I think we need to be positive. I commend the CRDCN for doing this. And I think we have to, we need the data. I think the two pieces of data I think are really encouraged are the job vacancy and wage survey data. I think we need linked labor force survey data as much as possible so we can see individual transitions. And I think we need to see better within households. We need to understand how households, families are managing this crisis and are absorbing and dealing with it. And that's it. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you. J'entends vos plaidoyers, chacun, pour l'importance de bonnes données. Thank you, Michael, for your thoughts. Thank you to all of you for your very inspiring thoughts and insights. We received, like I said, we received quite a few questions in advance, really good questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read them to you, and I already told you in advance of which one I'm going to be calling to address each of these questions. So I identified two persons who will address each question. So I'm starting with the question for Kevin and Andrew. Question is as follows. Could you speak to the importance of hearing from diverse perspectives when researching the impact of COVID-19 on income and employment? Oh, Kevin or Andrew?
Sure.
Are you?
Yeah, I always learn from listening from others, and those with different backgrounds have a lot to say. And I generally enrich the outcome when you hear from more people.
In my case, I interpreted the question a little bit differently, and I thought about it. I already spoke a little bit about the importance of tracking developments in inequality, but what's really important here too is to try to represent the diversity of outcomes among people, and how often those diversities of outcomes line up across certain lines. Statistics Canada does support diverse analysis of this through providing indicators on the surveys that allow for disaggregation. I admit that these aren't perfect and they're not complete and on every survey. But we make that effort when we can, and we're learning how to do it better all the time. Other possibilities include record linkage. We have good records on bringing together data from diverse sources to allow for a better look at things. We recently linked together a social assistance file from British Columbia with other data to make it richer. And then, of course, that leads me to, there's always room and opportunity for partnerships. We've had some success bringing in files from researchers that can be integrated with other data to increase their value for research. I'm particularly interested in homelessness data, something that we really have a major gap on, and sometimes the academic community has access to data like this that we could integrate with other data at Statistics Canada and perhaps make available for others to use.
Thank you. Next question for Louis and Andrew. It's about the gig economy. So pre-COVID, about 1 in 10 Canadians in the labor force worked in the gig economy. So one participant is asking whether precarious employment will become a new normal as more and more people join the gig economy. So perhaps, Louis, you want to start?
Sure, I can get started. So I think to me, that's a difficult question to answer. We don't really know how it's going to pan out. One thing I could say is that there was a trend before the pandemic where more people are working in those gig economy jobs, and those trends are linked to different things like the advancement of technology where we can actually work from home on some of those. I mean, population aging too. You think that some people, as they get older, they want to slow down. Maybe the traditional job don't satisfy this, so they take more contractual work on the side. But the one thing that struck me from the one survey or study that was done using administrative data last year by StatsCan is that actually over 50% of those that work gig work, they do it as a second job, as a source of supplement to their income. And so it's not their main job per se. So that is a trend. The other thing that was highlighted in this pandemic is that some of those jobs, like in the gig economy, have certainly less job security and benefits overall. So when there's a shock that hits, these people are less protected in a sense. So as the federal government, we are trying to work to improve this situation for all workers. But the point is maybe that could actually reduce the attractiveness of some of those jobs going forward. So we hope not, because that's a trend that maybe allows more flexibility for an aging population. But these are some of the concerns that we could think about.
Thank you. Andrew, I just want to mention that some of your colleagues last week published a short study on the impact of COVID-19 on the gig economy. So turning to you.
Yeah, that's right. Interestingly, to add to what Louis said, I think that the real key towards understanding what's going on in the gig economy is to just define it and measure it well. That's something that we're missing right now. We don't really have a clear method for identifying gig workers within the traditional labor force survey. And national statistics agencies all around the world are trying to discuss how to define gig workers in the best way now. So it's in part, we have data on it, but it's a data gap still. We normally describe gig workers as being what we sometimes call solo self-employed or self-employed with no employees. And that's a definition that's been around for a long, long time, but probably doesn't fully overlap with what people think about as being the gig workers. It includes people that aren't really gig workers and misses out on some. So it's still partly a data gap. As for what we do know about what's happened with gig work in the slowdown, We know that there hasn't been a large number hasn't been a large change in the number of gig workers through the last couple of months, but there's been a reduction in the number of hours, and including an increase of the number of people that report working 0 hours. And so, in some ways, they're remaining attached to the labor force, but certainly there's an impact there.
Thank you. Next question, I'm going to ask an academic, Kevin, to provide an answer, and then a policymaker, Louis, to answer this question. So the question is, what measures do governments need to take to better connect underemployed and unemployed with job opportunities? So perhaps Kevin?
Sure. So right now, as I said, my estimate is something like 7 million people have been put out of work or into substantially reduced hours. Let's take what Mikhail suggested a while ago, something like 40% of those may not return. Let's just say half as a number to work with. So that means, we have 3.5 million more people out of work, which is not a good thing, but let's focus on the other 3.5 million for a minute, because getting from 7 million out of work to only 3.5 million out of work is actually a very big deal in terms of society functioning. And so we want to make sure that we get from that 7 million down to 3.5 million or whatever it might be in the months that come. So in order to make those connections, what I think is the most important thing is to remove the barriers to making those connections. So, as I said, my local barber opened up. How does he make sure that his staff is able to show up? Well, there are child care, elder care, and household responsibilities and children responsibilities. 10 feet from me, my boy is working on his schoolwork, and he's doing that for an hour. It does take some time out of my day. He's not in childcare age, but it takes some time, and many people are dealing with this in much more difficult circumstances than I might be. Childcare, there's also the health aspects of it, making sure that people feel safe and are safe in their workplaces, especially those who may be immune compromised or have elderly people in their household, etc. So those are the barriers to making matches. It might be that the barber says, yep, I want to open up. I know Kevin's coming to get his hair cut. And there's a barber who says, yep, I want to come and rent that chair from you again. That's a labor market match that is waiting to happen. But what if that barber has kids? What if that barber lives with an elder? What if that barber has health conditions of his own? So working to remove those barriers is really important. And final point on this, some have been suggesting that there'll be no recovery unless we deal with those things. I actually think it's a bit worse than that. There will be a recovery. We're going to go from that 7 million who are now out of work or in decreased work. That's going to decrease. Barbers are getting back to work in BC, and et cetera, et cetera. But the question then is, how does that look for people who have childcare responsibilities, have elder responsibilities? We are going to have a recovery. It's not going to be complete, of course. It's going to be partial, but which part goes back? If it is only those who happen to be lucky and have nice home circumstances that allow them to go back to work, that's going to be a tremendously, not just unfair, but inefficient recovery, because we're not going to be able to make use of all the economic talents of those who are in caregiving responsibilities and other barriers that allow them not to work. So there will be a partial recovery. It will just be a very inefficient and unfair one. So that's why we need to work on removing those barriers to allowing those labor market connections to be remade. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a big question. Louis, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin had some really interesting points. I think very relevant. Those barriers are an important consideration. I think the fact that there is a resumption of the economy in itself, the market forces should allow a placement of people into job, whether it will be optimal or allocation, that musical chair that Mikhail was talking about, but ultimately market forces should prevail. And as I said at the beginning, we were in a labor shortage not so long ago, so we were missing some workers. Those job vacancies were around 500,000 jobs that were vacant because no one could fill them. And so the point is market forces are there, but certainly the government can help, and we do have some programs and tools in place. So we have a great app called Job Bank, and it's also on Job Bank within the Canada.ca government, and that's basically a place where employers could put their job postings, and people that are unemployed could look for job opportunities. But there's also a lot of other, obviously, websites like that. But also provinces and territories offer some employment services for those that are unemployed, and this is partly, actually mostly subsidized by the federal government, and that is another tool that is available for people out of job to find a job.
See, thank you. There's quite a bit of question coming in that I see right now live, so perhaps if we can keep the answer shorter so we can take more questions from people who send their question today. Next question, can you speak to the importance of gender differences in employment and income, differences in employment and income COVID effects? What are the main reasons for these gender differences? I'm asking Mikhail and Andrew to comment on that.
I kind of wish I could just repeat what Kevin said. You know, mostly with policy, the problem you have is you have a trade-off between fairness and equity, fairness and efficiency, equity and efficiency. That's the challenge for policymakers, is facing that trade-off. What we're talking about here is it's not a trade-off. We're in a situation where these constraints are, you know, they're affecting equity and efficiency. I mean, it's a no-brainer. We need to address these constraints, and we're going to do better on both fronts. The gender piece on this, why are women being hit harder? It's the occupations they're in primarily are much more likely to involve human interactions. So that's the sectors that have been shut down. But then also what Kevin and I think are saying is that there are these constraints. And I mean, there is endless amounts of research to show that these constraints, the caregiving responsibilities within households, fall on women. And so there's no question. I've looked in the most recent labor force survey, among those people who are absent from work full week and are asked, you know, why were you absent from last week? The number who say they're absent because of childcare responsibilities is 4 times larger for women than for men. So, yeah.
Yeah, I invite the questioner to look at the recent labor force survey releases. There's a lot of really interesting breaking out of the information among men and women, including what Mikhail just said, and sort of how in the first month of the downturn, the job losses were higher among women because of the concentration in service sectors, but then it turned around a little bit, became a little more highly concentrated among men. And then had the dynamics of the family too, where you have you know, dual learner families, and then you have losses in one job of a dual learner family, or losses in both jobs of the dual learner family. You know, we have good statistics on all of those things. And you know, to come back to my other point, you know, these things are going to affect the market income of families. And so the question is going to be then, you know, are other things going to step in to take the place of that missing market income, such as the government transfers that are available? Are people's market incomes going to recover? Are we going to be left with a structurally higher level of market income inequality? I think those are really, really interesting questions, and the gender dynamic plays an important central role in that.
Thank you. I will ask one last question from the one that were submitted in advance, and then I believe it's Grant who's going to ask the questions that are being asked today. What are we learning about gaps in Canada's income security system, and what it means as we look forward in terms of reforms? Mikhail and Kevin, would you speak to that?
Sure, I'll be brief here. Something that's clear is that we need some more serious strategy on sick leave. I noted that at the announcement from Rideau Cottage today, there was an announcement about working with the provinces to put something in place in the short run, and I know the government in BC has been pushing very hard on this. So hopefully there'll be some movement there. I think that is an important piece. to understand what we should do. There are provisions now in the EI system. I'm not terribly familiar with them, but I know they're there. Clearly, they can be ameliorated. Second thing is thinking about part-time workers, self-employed, the gig workers. You know, there are, in the long run, challenges there. You know, allowing people who are self-employed to self-assess into I'm not working right now, there are some clear difficulties with that if you attach big benefits to that. I think we can all understand why that might be a challenge. At the same time, what we saw in you know, the CERB and opening up the CERB to people who are part-time and self-employed, and I had no personal objection to as an emergency measure. As we move forward to looking at long-term measures, I think we need to revisit what kind of income supports we're going to offer people who are in those sectors and how to design them. I think it's a tricky thing because, as I said, self-assessing into I have no work right now is a more challenging thing when you are a self-employed person. And so understanding how to design income security for those sectors, I think a big challenge we have in the long run, but an important one as well.
Thank you. Mikhail?
Yeah, so I don't have much. This is not my strong suit. This is Kevin's for sure. But I will say, I mean, the only thing I'll say about the policy and these kind of income security gaps is there was some criticism of the existing EI system and the number of workers that didn't cover. And I felt that wasn't fair. I mean, I think it's outrageous that we have a completely exceptional economic shock that nobody anticipated. I mean, this is a once in a lifetime shock here. We may need to think about how we provide income security in the future based on this experience, but to criticize what was there before based on this is I think not fair.
Thank you. So I want to make sure we have more time for the questions. So I think now the way it works, it's Grant. You're going to be reading those questions from the Q&A box.
Yeah, we've got a bunch, so that's great. And if people don't mind if I hand them out too, I think this is probably a good one for Louis and Mikhail. It's from Tracy Campbell. We used to have very strong career development information and programming. Governments have decreased funding. The question is, does the panel believe individuals can interpret labor market information without assistance to make informed career decisions? And then can you comment on the ability of employers to do the same?
Louis, you want to go first?
I was hoping you would go first.
I will go first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think this, to some extent, you know, it was huge. When I was doing my undergraduate degree and PhD, job training was a massive research literature. And there was a lot of government investment in job training. I used to be on the board of directors for an organization called Essential Skills Ontario that was about providing very basic literacy skills for working people. I think it fell off the radar, and for good reason. And I think it's going to come back on. I think there's clearly a need for it. I mean, I maybe want to stress too that, you know, the position I gave is, I think maybe I'm a little bit biased towards trying to ensure that we don't underestimate what this shock is and what kind of a longer term effects is going to be. But maybe I don't want to overstate it either. Kevin is exactly right. There is going to be a rebound, no question. Let's hope that's a strong rebound. But there will be workers left over. There will be job displacement. There will be reallocation. I think we need to all be on the forefront of that. We want to be thinking about that in advance. How we allow we address constraints and we address training that enables workers to make those transitions.
I would say there are a few resources available for those that want some information on the labor market and to take some career decisions at this stage. So my team actually produces COPS. COPS is not the police, but it's the Canadian Occupational Projection System. And we put out projections for 10 years out of occupations, about 300 occupations, and where their prospects are in the long run. And this was done just in February. We published this online on a 3-year cycle. Obviously, things are somewhat different compared to February, but the point is we were mostly focusing on a 10-year horizon. So these are things that are long run. And when you think about where the economy is headed and some of the demands and the skills that are in demand when you think about technology and green jobs and all of those, like those I would assume would still apply post COVID. So and there's also the Labor Market Information Council of Canada that puts out also some of this information from a provincial point of view too. So maybe there's been a decrease in funding, but there are still resources out there.
Okay, and the next question comes from Jane Friesian. So the closure of schools and childcare centers, senior homes also have emerged as dangerous locations. And the question really kind of is trying to ask the panelists to think about how this is going to change the labor decision and home care for dependents. And what the policy response should be given these changes. So Kevin and Andrew, maybe.
Sure. So I agree, and as that coincides with my previous comment about the matching in the labor market and removing those constraints to making those matches and those barriers. This is an important part of it. In terms of a solution to that, understand why childcare market and schools and other things, why those are barriers right now. It's not because people don't have money. I don't think that the money situation hasn't changed so dramatically. It's that the production side of this, the supply side of this, you can't open a childcare with the same number of spaces as before because it is deemed by public health officials to not be safe because of the interactions. And so, trying to fix, whether it's summer camps, whether it's childcare, whether it's school in the fall, we need to understand that it is a supply side thing. It is figuring out how to make these situations safe so we can expand it. Maybe we need to have twice as many summer camps with twice as many staff per student so we can have more space. If that's a very important thing, which I think it is, then those resources may be worth spending. And so understanding that's where it comes from, it's a supply side thing, is the first step in trying to figure out what solution to have. Providing a subsidy for parents for summer camps is not going to be what unlocks this problem. It's going to be dealing with the supply side. So that's where I would look.
And just to add to what Kevin said, another interesting aspect of the question around childcare and senior care is about the people that work in these places. They're also among the most vulnerable in the labor market. They're often people of color and most often women. We did a study at Statistics Canada that looked at the homelessness support sector. So these are the individuals that work in homeless shelters, and it found that these are individuals had very similar characteristics to the people that were in the homeless shelters and often had homelessness experiences themselves in the past. So it's interesting to note that many of these questions have important inequality consequences.
Okay, and just with a few minutes left, I'm just going to try to whip through the last few. I'm going to stick with Andrew. Is there any research on the size of the informal economy and whether the pandemic is leading to an increase in the informal economy?
Well, I would say Statistics Canada does have occasionally estimates on the size of the informal underground economy. I'm not an expert in it, so I wouldn't really want to speculate on it. But it does sort of highlight something that I find interesting, which is, broadly speaking, we know a lot about what I would call the top 1%. So these are the CEOs and the executives, and we know how much money they make, and we know who they are, and we see them in the Forbes 500, blah, blah, blah. We don't really know much about the bottom 1%, like the bottom 1%. These are individuals who may not participate in our surveys, they may not participate in our censuses, they may not be in our administrative data, or if they are, maybe they show up here or not there. I think that would be an interesting research agenda, to think about whom we're missing in our data and who we could better characterize in our data as the bottom 1%.
Okay, and one more just to close off. Mikal, this question is about the scarring effect. Graduating in a recession has a negative impact on labor market outcomes. What should we do for the class of 2020?
So actually, I do a lot more research on immigration, and the same result appears in that literature, that recent immigrants that just by chance arrive during a recession, arrive in Canada during a recession, have much more difficulty. And so what do we do? Well, I don't think there's much we can do. I mean, I think what you're going to see is we certainly don't want to discourage or make it difficult for students to continue their education and continue training. If there aren't jobs available, then I think you want to do as much as possible to continue to invest in human capital. I heard some crazy people arguing that this is a good time to kind of put off your education because it's going to be online, which to me seems crazy. The opportunity cost here is very low. So I think that's the most important thing is to make sure there aren't barriers to training and education.
Okay, so I'll pass it back to Carol to close us off. And
Merci, Graham. Well, yes, we are almost out of time. I just want to, on behalf of the CRDCN, I would like to thank all four panelists for a very insightful and passionate contributions. It was really interesting. Merci beaucoup aux quatre panélistes, Kevin, Louis, Andrew, Michael. Merci aussi à tous ceux, toutes et tous qui se sont joints à nous aujourd'hui. Thank you of all those to all of those who joined us today. I invite you to, as we see on the screen now, I invite you to and encourage you to register for the next webinars that will take place this week. Si ce n'est pas déjà fait, je vous encourage à vous inscrire aux 3 autres webinaires qui auront lieu cette semaine, mardi, mercredi, jeudi. I'd like to remind you that there's a video recording of this webinar that will be available on the CRDCN website soon. So thanks once again, thanks very much to all of you. Merci beaucoup et je vous souhaite une bonne journée.
Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.